Hello everyone, this is the TableTalk podcast, where we bring people together who wouldn't normally meet under normal circumstances to join the conversation on current hot topics around campus and the country.
Today your host is Amanda. In this first podcast, we bring to you 4 students from the university to talk about the general gun control situation in the United States.
Hello, I'm Dave Long, a local Atlanta resident and student here at Emory, my junior year studying environmental science, and I hope to bring a perspective of someone who's got a lot of friends on sort of both sides of the issue.
Hello, I'm Alex Yoakum. I'm a junior as well, and I'm studying philosophy, comparative literature, and I'm from Texas originally, and I hope to offer a unique perspective from the left that is under-discussed, I think.
Hi everyone, my name is Lee Schlecht. I'm a junior in the college studying comparative literature and interdisciplinary studies. I grew up in the Midwest in a pretty conservative environment, so I'm hoping to add that to the discussion today.
All right, welcome guys. So let's ask a few pretty straightforward questions first. Just remember that we're not trying to fight. We're not trying to be confrontational. We're just trying to bring this conversation out there to the Emory community. So first, just answer. Do you grow up around guns? And have you shot a gun before? And in what environment?
I grew up around guns. It's pretty common in Wisconsin to take a hunter safety course in 4th or 5th grade. I didn't take one, but every single other person in my grade did. And most of my uncles and grandparents were also pretty big hunters. I have shot a gun, mostly in shooting ranges, but also hunting.
I did not grow up around guns. I grew up in an urban area to liberal parents. So most of my childhood, I hadn't really spent much time around guns. In my teenage years, I started talking and meeting a lot more hunters and fishers and people in Georgia's outdoor community, and did, spend more time around guns. I've never actually shot one, though, but, yeah.
Yeah, like the stereotypes in Texas would probably show. I did grow up around guns and a lot of conservative people who love guns. In terms of whether I've shot guns, yes, a lot of them. I shot them usually at like the ranch that my dad leased, and most of my family kind of actually collects guns for, whatever reason you collect anything else, I guess. That's pretty much it.
And this is, okay, thank you guys. And this is a question that is aimed at anyone who's willing to answer it. How will you explain the gun control environment in the U.S. to foreigners?
Oh boy, let me think.
So the gun control debate has had a pretty long history in the U.S., starting with the Second Amendment, which was allowed to kind of give the colonies an excuse or a legitimate reason to revolt against the British. The next time it was pretty hotly debated was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, during the time when Black Panther came up. So they had a lot of images of people in the Black Panther Party with rifles, AK-47s, on the steps in different places. And while they didn't necessarily use the guns, the term that was used to refer to that was a shadow threat, to say that we have these rights too, and we're comfortable protecting our rights. So that's something that's often overlooked because you tend to think of the gun control debate as a predominantly white male issue, but it hasn't always been that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think something else to consider is that the history of gun control is kind of complex as well. Like Lee was saying, during the 60s, the Black Panther Party actually was a very big advocate of having access to guns. Usually what they would do is they would use those for self-defense and monitoring police activity. So they would go out in their communities and neighborhoods and use it for self-defense against racist police officers, essentially, and would monitor them and make sure that they're conducting their police activities within good ways, I suppose. And the first actual gun control policy was actually way back during prior to the Civil War, where slaves were actually forbidden to own guns in the first place. And so there's kind of like a history of gun control that is linked to sort of this disarming of particular populations. And I think that that is something that is often overlooked within the gun control debate, and the history of who ought to have guns and like who ends up getting policed for having access to those guns.
Yeah, I mean, like it or not, firearms are woven into the fabric of America. It goes back to, basically as soon as we had guns in this country, they're very much woven into American notions of freedom and certain class identities, and certainly race politics too. And, as much as they are a practical object, that many Americans use to put meat on the table, or many Americans who live in areas that don't get the best police access use for, even just a feeling of safety, whether or not they actually use it or not. So as much as they are a practical tool, they're also very much a symbol here in America. And lots of Americans, we are a very diverse country, interpret that symbol very differently.
Yeah, let's talk about that further. I think the greatest international voice right now about gun control is the mass shootings in schools. And I would like to know your guys' understanding of these shootings, not in terms of why it's happening, but in terms of what are the debates going on around that in comparison with comparing the NRA,
Yeah.
and the liberal agenda. What are these dynamics that you guys are seeing?
So one thing that is kind of ubiquitous on both sides of the debate is this notion of mental illness as a cause of violence. And I think that both liberals and more conservative people make this argument insofar as like there's a mental health crisis in the United States, and they are the real threat or whatever to, like school shootings or violence or whatever. But I think that that is a very, very false narrative. What's actually, even if the statistical analysis have shown that people who have mental illness tend to be less violent, or at the very least not more violent than any other person in the population. I think there was like a 4, maybe 5% difference, but it's actually more likely that they're subject to violence instead of perpetrators of violence. And another study said that only 22% of mass shootings were caused or had someone who was mentally ill be the shooter. But I think that this kind of category of the mentally ill that's kind of used within these sort of debates is probably problematic in that it kind of re-stigmatized mental illness, right? I think that what's being missed here is there are other factors, so to speak, in the debate other than mental illness. In terms of sort of other parts of the debate, I think that the main sort of question that liberals try to frame it as is lives versus this like decaying right to guns, whereas conservatives kind of try to frame it as a right to freedom and a sort of a way to prevent governmental tyranny. My perspective is a little bit different than that, in that I think that, like with mass shootings, I think that there are certain policies that we can adopt to prevent some of them, i.e. production side things, which is like limiting bump stocks and changing the production of guns, but not necessarily banning guns, because I think that that would have a racially disparate impact.
I agree about the production of guns, especially as it's relatively easy to make what are called smart guns. So for example, a safety on a modern handgun, you already have to put your forefinger in a certain position in order to unlock it and be able to shoot it. So in that case, it would make sense that manufacturers could put on something that recognizes a specific fingerprint, which would prevent someone who did not own the gun from getting it, accessing it, bringing it to a place and shooting it up, which I think is pretty valid. I would say of the two perspectives that Alex just gave us, personally, I don't think taking away people's guns is something that's legal or doable in many senses. But I think a lot of stricter regulations is pretty easy to accomplish. Japan, for example, requires all people applying for a permit to pass a legislative test, a marksmanship test, and a background check. And then they have to renew that license every 10 years when they have a firearm. And that, I think, is something that we could feasibly introduce into the U.S. and allow that to really control who is fit to own a gun and who can have access to that weapon.
Yeah, you'll bring up some good points. So trying to go kind of back to the question and leading it to what y'all were talking about. When you're talking about school shootings, you're talking about the death of children, which is a very emotional wound that kind of opens up this, obviously a lot of emotions for, the people who survived or loved ones of the dead. But I think it definitely very much opens up the stage to opinions of gun control that from the left that might not be particularly well informed or even well stated. Things like saying we should ban assault rifles. Well, assault rifle is not that's a relative term. That really more refers to like what the gun looks like than anything. There are all sorts of semi-automatic rifles out there. Some are great for shooting squirrels, some are great for shooting humans, and like what you call an assault rifle is kind of relative. But then I think you also you get that, and that creates a sort of knee-jerk reaction from people on the far right, or people who have a very strong cultural connection to guns that hear we want to take away what you have, want to take away your freedoms, and they respond with more hatred. And I think it just kind of plows over a lot of people in the middle who might want to talk more specific regulations, something like bump stocks, or people who just want to own a gun for hunting and don't really understand this whole debate that's going on and want to keep their gun but like don't want kids to die and don't really want to pick either of these camps.
How does this issue of school shootings collide with hunter culture in terms of the argument with guns and banning all guns?
I would say that it collides with gun culture, which is part of hunter culture, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
I don't think it does at all. The reason being is because the types of weapons that are used in school shootings are not used for hunting. Case in point, the AR-15, which a lot of people kind of misunderstand as a weapon, is a semi-automatic weapon with usually a magazine size dependent on, usually it comes with like a 15 to 30 magazine size, just stock. The caliber for the AR-15 is 223, which is like barely a half step above a regular 22 caliber. There are actually regulations that prevent you from using a 223 to hunt, except for specific animals, because otherwise it's inhumane, because it's not a strong enough caliber to hunt anything with. So I think that any regulations we'd put on guns that are like AR-15s would not conflict with hunter culture very much, because the types of guns used in hunting are not, AR-15s. They are 30-06, 30-30s, like they are stronger weapons that are usually lever or bolt action and have smaller magazine sizes.
Generally, though, I can think of a lot of exceptions to that. Things they call like modern sportsman's rifles, which are like a modified AR platform that shoot TT3 or sometimes a different caliber. But then you also have things like ARs that shoot 22 bullets, and I don't know, there's pretty much, if you can think of a type of gun, someone's invented it. So I think you really do have to be very specific with what type of gun you're talking about.
I agree that the language is a problem, because from a specific tool perspective, talking about the different kinds of guns, then the distinctions are easy to make. But when you ask about hunter culture versus trying to stop school shootings, when we just talk about, like, the media will say there should be a ban on guns, or it becomes much more general because they assume the layperson doesn't have a lot of knowledge. And for that reason, a lot of people who are invested in hunting take offense to that, because they feel like they're being singled out for owning a gun, even though they've done nothing to contribute to mass shootings. And obviously there are exceptions to that, But the fact that there is no distinction between the two makes it a lot more difficult, I think, to get support for it. I will say that in terms of differentiating between types of guns, the place where you're going to buy those guns generally doesn't change very much, because if you're going to a sporting goods store like Dick's or Cabela's or something, you'll see handguns next to semi-automatic weapons, and it's difficult for them to institute policies on certain types of guns that they can't apply to other types of guns, even though they're used for very different things. So in that sense, even though I wouldn't say hunters directly contribute to school shootings, the cause has been so generalized that it makes it harder to differentiate between the two, and I think that a lot of people then become demonized for wanting to protect something that they value.
All right, guys. That was a great discussion. Now it's the time for us to pose a question, not by me, but by one of you guys.
Wait, to you or to the audience or
To
these?
to each other.
So I feel like with this most recent Stoneman, I forget the exact name of the school in Florida shooting. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like unlike other times, people have been talking a bit more about specific regulation. Like I've heard talk of, bump stocks, or Florida was considering moving the age from 18 to 21. What are some of the things that you've noticed about, where we are right now that signal a positive transition towards better understanding, and better cooperation from both sides of the aisle? And what are some of the negative things you've seen come out of this most recent shooting?
One of the positives I've seen is a lot of legislative moves, because something's actually being done about it, good or bad. People are talking about it and moving it through the process. However, in Florida, the House of Representatives just voted to arm teachers, and while that hasn't passed through everything yet, I personally believe that arming teachers is a terrible idea. Even keeping a gun in a desk where children are likely to go through a desk or not have that concept of personal space yet, and if a kid can get access to that gun, that's terrible. Also, if teachers are expected to then hurt an assailant coming in, or someone like a shooter, and then they have to either decide that they're comfortable enough to shoot this gun, or God forbid, what if they miss and hit someone else?
And you can never predict that. I mean, I've talked to a couple veterans and law enforcement veterans about this, and they say it's the biggest load of horse shit they've ever heard. They're like, you don't know jack about how people are going to react in that situation, and certainly not, teachers who have, that's not their job. And then you talk to teachers and they say the same thing. They're like, you want me to carry a gun, but you won't even get me new fucking pencils? As one high school teacher friend of mine put it, he said that, well, why don't we take the cops and the security guards from the Capitol and the government buildings and let the legislators and politicians arm themselves and fend for themselves? Which, I think it's just, I don't know who came up with that or why it's been taken so seriously. If anyone can educate me, please do.
Yeah, so I guess something positive that I've seen in terms of cooperation is some of these more manufacturing or production based regulations based off of bump stocks, increasing the age from 18 to 21, all those things I 100% agree with, and I think that it's good that both liberals and conservatives are kind of moving more towards their interests kind of overlap, I think, a bit better now. Something that I think is negative is a couple things that I mentioned earlier, and I think that this might be best made in reference to the CNN town hall that was hosted with all the Stoneman Douglas students. Between Stoneman Douglas students, Marco Rubio and another senator, and someone from the NRA, I think it was Dana something, sorry. But essentially what happened in this discussion, and I think that what makes a lot of these discussions negative and unproductive, is first of all, there's kind of a lack of understanding on more so on the liberal side about what guns are, what they look like, what kind of the way that regulations and how they would be enforced would kind of come about. And I think that the second thing is something that is probably negative, I think, is again, this stigmatization of mental illness. The representative from the NRA said we should catch these insane monsters, specific words that were said. And I think that sort of stigmatization that kind of exists both on the left and the right, I think is probably pretty bad and leads to some pretty terrible consequences, i.e. There was legislation proposed by Republicans within the last few months, I think, maybe right after one of the last big school shootings, that basically said that we should limit the gun rights for people who try to use like a stand-in for financial services. So i.e. like if you have a mental illness that kind of affects your ability to assess your finances, then you have a stand-in for that, right? And so what Republicans were trying to push was that people who have that stand-in should not be able to access guns. And I think that is probably something that leads to things where people cannot defend themselves who are subject to more violence based from the police and from hate crimes. The final thing that I'll say that I think is negative is sort of this increasing militarization of schools. Because another kind of common theme that was in this sort of discussion at Stoneman Douglas with the town hall was that we need to increase police presence in schools and that we need to increase the amount of security within schools. One of the kids said that we should put Kevlar in the walls. Like I just am very skeptical of turning like public schools into fortresses where police are constantly roaming the halls. Like you can kind of see how that would be bad, because what's going to happen is like the school to prison pipeline is going to get a lot worse because there's just a lot more like policing of schools. People of color like are probably not going to feel safe walking into those schools. So I think that those are probably the positive and negative things I would say that are kind of happening within this debate.
So a final thing before we close this up. You have two options. What will you tell the Trump administration or your advice? Or what is the one thing that's on your mind right now that you really want to say about this issue?
Well, I have a lot of things I'd like to tell the Trump administration. I don't know if all of them are appropriate to say on a podcast. One thing I would like to say just though to people is that, you know, you got to get out there and talk to people, and you got to get off Facebook to really understand these things, I think, holistically. You know, like if you're anti-gun and you want to make a difference and you want to, you know, create gun regulation, I suggest you go talk to some gun owners. A lot of them are a lot more friendly than you'd actually think if you approach them from a perspective of trying to learn. And the other way around too. I mean, I encourage, you know, those who do feel very strongly and feel like their freedoms are being infringed on to go, you know, try and not put up too many walls and try and talk to people on the other side of the aisle as best you can. Yeah, you know, I think it's very easy these days to take straight to social media and start posting things and, you know, trying to get reactions, and we live in a very emotionally charged time, and I think we just need to sit down with each other, you know, have a beer and say like what's on our minds, you know, in a nice way.
I agree, and I think another thing to consider in lieu of your suggestion about the Trump administration is that we don't necessarily have to go through the government to do it. Dick's Sporting Goods is a really good example where even though it's not legislated, they're now going to be instituting stronger background checks for anyone who tries to buy a weapon. And I think we've seen a lot of those smaller scale movements recently, especially with the idea of sanctuary cities, etc. And so I think it's very important to keep in mind that even if the government isn't doing something about it or isn't doing what you want them to do about it, it seems to me at least that we have other options. And there are ways in which people can accomplish things without having to be stymied at every turn by this legislative process.
So now why we have the Second Amendment.
I guess my final thought is that kind of, how should I put this? In a world where many people feel very unsafe crossing the street at night, both through the threat of violence from other people, whether it be hate crimes, sexual violence, or state-sanctioned violence by the police, I think that it is way more important for us to not disarm the populace, but probably disarm the police, or at least create stronger limitations, because I think that the state has a monopoly of violence, and I think that taking away our means of defending ourselves from that monopoly of violence is probably not a good idea, especially when we have an administration that is very keen on committing violence to particular sections of the population.
Interesting.
All right, guys, this was a great conversation. Thanks for joining us and being part of the first Table Talk podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Table Talk podcast. If you enjoyed our topic this week and have suggestions for other conversations that need to happen, feel free to send us a message on our Facebook page at TableTalk Emory. Our next organizational events are Table Talks between Slow Food and Questbridge, and open to the public is the Rubber Chicken Initiative on April 19th at Caldi's. Come out and be a part of the event. Rubber chickens nationwide are calling seriously distressing. Get ready to laugh and or cry as Emory students tell sad stories about themselves. Take the initiative, squeeze a chicken.